2 months before my wedding, my brother knocked up my fiancé and wanted to marry her, so my mother offered her money and asked her to marry her favorite son. So I cut everyone out of my life and left to begin a new chapter. 3 years later, my ex-fiancée arrived at my door in worn-out clothes, with a child by her side, and gave me a letter from my mom demanding I fix the mess my brother had created. But I refused and kicked her out. 3 years ago, I was engaged to a woman, I'll call her Lila. At that time, I genuinely believed she was the love of my life. Lila and I had been together for nearly 5 years, and our relationship felt solid. We were both lawyers, which meant we led demanding, fast-paced lives, but we always made sure to prioritize each other when we had free time. The year I proposed to Lila was supposed to be the happiest year of our lives, but that same year, something unexpected happened. She lost her job. The loss came after she was found breaking some company rules. I won't go into the specifics of what happened because it's personal, but what I will say is that the company let her go pretty unceremoniously after what she did to them. Now, if you've ever known an overachieving workaholic, you might understand how such a loss can shake them to their core. Work wasn't just a job for Lila, it was part of her identity, her pride, and her purpose. Losing it so abruptly left her reeling. Lila threw herself into the job hunt almost immediately, applying to countless firms and corporations. Unfortunately, her field was highly specialized, and opportunities weren't exactly easy to come by, especially after the circumstances of her dismissal. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and she still hadn't secured a new position. Through all of this, I tried to be as supportive as I could. I assured her that she didn't need to worry about finances. We were engaged, after all, and I saw it as my responsibility to take care of her during this rough patch. Knowing Lila's tendency to obsess over things and stress herself out, I urged her to relax and not let the situation consume her. To my relief, she took my advice, or at least she tried to. With her newfound free time, she decided to pursue something that had always been a dream of hers, learning pottery. She enrolled in a local pottery class and began dedicating her spare hours to this new hobby. This was also the same pottery class that my brother Mason went to. Let me tell you a bit about Mason. He's the complete opposite of me. While I was the responsible, nerdy one growing up who focused on my studies and career, Mason was the quintessential troublemaker. He spent his school days goofing off, getting into mischief, and earning himself a reputation as a carefree playboy. That reputation followed him into college and beyond. He was the kind of guy who never stayed with a girl for long and rarely took anything seriously. Lila had met Mason early in our relationship and knew the kind of person he was. So when she started going to the same pottery class as Mason, I thought their paths crossing there was just a coincidence. But looking back, that was when things began to shift. At first, I didn't think much of it. Mason offered to pick her up and drop her off at class sometimes, which seemed thoughtful, though unusual. Lila would come home and excitedly tell me stories about what she and Mason had done at pottery class or show me the pieces they had worked on. But then their interactions extended beyond pottery. They began hanging out on weekends, doing things like visiting art museums or checking out new restaurants. These were activities that Lila and I would typically enjoy together, but now she was doing them more time with Mason than I was comfortable with, and it was starting to affect our relationship. She even began skipping date nights with me to hang out with him. I'm not the type to sit quietly and let things fester, so one evening I confronted her directly. I asked her point blank if there was something going on between her and Mason. Lila was taken aback by my question, offended even. She flat out denied that anything inappropriate was happening and insisted that her time with Mason was purely platonic. She explained that spending time with him was fun and lighthearted, comparing it to hanging out with a younger brother. She seemed genuinely hurt that I'd even suggest something more was going on, and for a moment, I felt guilty for doubting her. But deep down, her reassurances didn't completely ease my mind. Things came to a head just 2 months before our wedding. I was working tirelessly at that point, juggling an intense workload to make sure everything was in place financially. Ever since Lila had lost her job, I had taken on the full financial responsibility of our home and all the expenses for our upcoming wedding. She hadn't found new work yet, and while she used some of her savings for her personal needs or emergencies, I was shouldering most of the burden. Between paying for everything and the stress of planning a wedding, my hours at the office had grown longer and more grueling. I wasn't around as much as I should have been, and looking back, maybe that gave Lila and Mason the opportunity to get as close as they did. One evening, I came home early from a business trip. I was looking forward to surprising Lila and spending some quality time with her. As I pulled into the driveway, I immediately noticed my brother's car parked outside. Normally, I wouldn't have thought much of it. Mason had a habit of dropping by unannounced, but this time was different. It was already past 9 p.m., and seeing his car there so late raised a red flag. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside quietly, I could already hear faint laughter coming from within the house. The living room was empty, but the TV was on, its flickering light casting shadows across the room. My eyes were immediately drawn to the beer can scattered across the floor and then to the unmistakable sight of Lila's clothes and undergarments lying haphazardly among them. My stomach, I knew in that instant what I was about to walk into. A part of me wanted to turn around and leave, but another part, the part that needed undeniable proof, pushed me forward. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I walked slowly. Update, just 2 months before my wedding, my brother knocked up my fiancé and wanted to marry her, so my mother offered her money and asked her to marry her favorite son. So I cut everyone out of my life and left to begin a new chapter. 3 years later, my ex-fiancée arrived at my door in worn-out clothes, with a child by her side, and gave me a letter from my mom demanding I fix the mess my brother had created. But I refused and kicked her out. Part 2. My heart was pounding as I made my way toward the bedroom. I reached the doorway and stopped. They were there, Lila and Mason, tangled together in the most intimate way imaginable. They were so absorbed in each other that they didn't even notice me standing there. Normally, I'm a calm and collected person, but this was a betrayal of the highest order. My fiancée, the woman I was supposed to marry in just 2 months, was in bed with my own brother. Without saying a word, I stepped into the room, walked up to the bed, and grabbed Mason by the back of his neck. I yanked his face away from Lila's, and the shock on his face was almost satisfying. He turned to look at me, and his expression shifted instantly from confusion to fear. I didn't even look at Lila. Mason stumbled immediately, mumbling apologies at me, but his words meant nothing to me at that moment. I struck him firmly. The sound of contact gave me grim satisfaction as his face turned red. He cried out in pain, but I wasn't done. I hit him again and again, each blow landing harder than the last. His shirt stained with blood, but I didn't care. He stumbled backward, his hands weakly trying to block me, but I kept going. After Mason was on the floor, bruised and pleading for mercy, I turned my attention to Lila. She sat on the bed, trembling and sobbing. Looked her straight in the eyes and said, my voice cold and measured, that she had 10 minutes to get out of my house. If she didn't, I told her I wouldn't hesitate to reduce her to the same state as my brother. She started pleading with me, apologizing over and over. She said she could explain and beg me not to kick her out, to give her a chance to fix things. But I wasn't interested in her excuses or apologies. I glanced at my watch and said flatly, you've got 9 minutes left. The tone of my voice and the look in my eyes must have told her I wasn't bluffing because she scrambled off the bed and began getting dressed with shaking hands. Tears streaked her face as she grabbed a suitcase from the closet and started packing whatever she could fit into it. When she was finally done packing, dragging her half-filled suitcase down the stairway, she turned to me one last time. Her voice was broken as she begged me to listen, claiming that she loved me and that she deserved the chance to explain herself. Without a word, I reached for her hand, slid my engagement ring off her finger, and pushed her toward the door. I opened the door and ushered her out into the night. She stumbled onto the porch, still crying and asking for forgiveness. I didn't even look back as I slammed the door shut in her face. Her muffled sobs were on the other side. Mason's I didn't want to be responsible for something worse happening to him. I called my parents and told them everything that had happened. My dad was furious at Mason, and my mom was shocked, but they both said they'd come over immediately. When they arrived, my mom, being a nurse, took charge of Mason's injuries. She cleaned and dressed his wounds, which, fortunately for him, were mostly superficial. Meanwhile, my dad pulled me out to the backyard, away from Mason. He could see that my hands were still shaking with anger and that I was barely holding it together. While later, Mason came outside with my mom, his face was bruised, his nose bandaged, and there were still traces of blood on his shirt. He apologized for betraying me, claiming that he hadn't meant for things to happen this way. But then he dropped the bombshell, he said that he was in love with Lila. I finally turned to face him, my eyes like daggers. He kept going, explaining how he believed Lila felt the same way about him. He claimed that this was the first time they had been together, as if that somehow made it better. Then he pulled out his phone and showed me their messages, conversations full of flirty texts, secrets, and Lila confessing how unhappy she was in our relationship. According to Mason, she was the one who had invited him over that night since she thought I would still be on my work trip. As I stood there reading those messages, my rage boiled over again. Mason kept talking, telling me how sorry he was for betraying me but also insisting that he'd never felt this way about anyone before. He said he couldn't stop himself and begged me to forgive him. His words felt like daggers twisting in the wound. My dad, who had been listening quietly, finally had enough. He scolded Mason harshly, telling him how deeply he had wronged me and how ashamed he should be of himself. But my mom's reaction was different. Mason had always been her favorite, and I could see her struggling with the situation. Mom started to tell me that regardless of what I decided to do about Lila, I needed to forgive my brother. She said he seemed genuinely remorseful, as if that somehow lessened the betrayal. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I cut her off and told my parents I wasn't in the mood for lectures or advice. The only thing I wanted at that moment was for them to take Mason and leave. I couldn't bear to look at him any longer. My dad nodded, understanding that I needed space, and he helped Mason to the car. My mom hesitated, wanting to stay and mediate, but eventually, she followed. In the weeks that followed, I was still grappling with the emotional fallout of Lila's betrayal. Lila had been texting me persistently, begging for forgiveness and trying to explain herself. But her explanations always circled back to the same excuses that were similar to what Mason had already told me. She claimed that she and Mason had never meant to hurt me. I had pretty much ignored her messages all those weeks. Then, out of nowhere, I received a phone call from Mason. He informed me that he and Lila had just found out that she was pregnant and that the baby was his. He told me that since she was carrying his child, he wanted to marry her and wanted my blessing. I couldn't believe the audacity he had to ask me this after everything they both had done. My mother's reaction only made everything worse. She had already been trying to play peacemaker between Mason and me, but now she seemed to view Lila's pregnancy as some kind of solution.